Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it is the 24th of December in Seoul, Christmas Eve, and I'm joined via Zoom by Ahyeong Park from the Transitional Justice Working Group to talk about the group's latest mapping project. Before we get started, please leave a review of this podcast so that more people can find us and listen to us. Secondly, check out nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. Thirdly, go to nknews.org/shop for our NK leadership chart, art posters, and more. As always, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Okay, to introduce my guest today properly, Ahyeong Park is a researcher at the Transitional Justice Working Group, or TJWG, a Seoul-based human rights documentation non-government organization. She oversees TJWG's mapping project, documenting and mapping locations connected to human rights violations in North Korea. You can find the Transitional Justice Working Group online at TJWG Seoul on Twitter or en.tjwg.org. Good morning and welcome on the show, Ahyeong.
Good morning, Jacko. Thanks for having me here today.
I have a lot of trouble saying TJWG all the time. Do you ever stumble over that?
Oh, yes. It's constant struggle.
Yes, it doesn't really fall off the mouth easily.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the origins of the Transitional Justice Working Group.
Oh, yes. So as you briefly mentioned during the introduction, Transitional Justice Working Group, so-called TJWG, is a Seoul-based NGO. And it was actually founded by human rights advocates and researchers from 5 different countries in 2014. And as you know, the year 2014 was a significant year in the history of the North Korean human rights field, because the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, published its report urging actions for accountability. So TJWG took action to respond to that and founded the organization. And to add to that, actually, TJWG is the first Korea-based NGO focused on transitional justice mechanisms in the world's most repressive regimes, including North Korea. So we aim to develop practical methods for addressing massive human rights violations and advocating justice for victims in pre- and post-transition societies. And to add on to that, we collaborate and share our practice with other organizations and individuals all across the globe concerned with the pursuit of accountability for mass atrocities and human rights abuses.
I know that NKDB also does a lot of tracking and categorizing of data. Do you work or have a liaison relationship with them?
Yes, we're aware of the work that NKDB does, and yes, we are in the same field. So yes, we do work together, and we, as you probably saw on the recent report, we have mentioned the NKDB's publication. So it's extremely crucial for any CSOs to work together in this field to get the latest information inside North Korea.
So just for our listeners at home, what's a CSO?
Civil society organizations.
Okay. And what, broadly speaking, what kind of projects does Transitional Justice Working Group carry out?
Yes. So broadly speaking, the TJWG has 3 main projects going on currently. So the main project to start off with is the mapping project that I am part of. So the mapping project utilizes a digital mapping system to document and visualize evidence of possible crimes against humanity in North Korea. The database and the mapping system we have securely collects information on mass graves and killing sites to be visualized in the form of digital maps. And the data we collect also includes locations of national security offices, local police, and military units where documentary evidence related to human rights abuses may be stored. And secondly is the access accountability, and which is also called AA. AA is an initiative of the TJWG and arose from our experience as a startup NGO, seeking resources and expertise to guide the development of our structure, project, and systems. So AA provides training and resources for human rights documentation groups globally through identifying areas of need and also matching them with expertise required to achieve their goals. So the main aim of AA is to assist groups involved in monitoring and documenting human rights abuses in any region, but particularly those who may be looking ahead to a transitional justice process in their local context. Last but not
Oh, sorry, just to interrupt. When you say transitional process, you're talking about a change of system from one type of government to another type of government. Is that basically what that means?
correct. Yes,
Okay.
correct.
All right. Yep. Sorry, go on to the third type of project that you do.
Sure. Last but not least is the footprints. And this was this is actually the most recent project that we've launched last year. So footprints is a joint civil society project to document and publish information concerning reported cases of arbitrary detention, abduction, and enforced disappearances committed in and by North Korea. That includes the victims, perpetrators, proceedings to seek redress, relevant human rights instruments, and North Korean resources. And this is actually it's an open and accessible and searchable online database that provides relational and geospatial information to the users. And you can find that on our website as well.
Okay. You recently issued a report based on a new mapping project. What was the purpose of this project?
Yeah, so December 2021 marks 10 years of Kim Jong Un's role in North Korea, which is quite significant. And it's been nearly 8 years since the UNCOI released its report urging actions for accountability. So the mapping project have been documenting human rights violations to support a stronger push for accountability, to respond to the UNCOI report, and also as a part of conceptualizing transitional justice for North Korea. So we, as a mapping project team, release a report every 2 years. So the last report that we released was in 2019. So it's already been 2 years since the last report. So now we've released a new report called Mapping Killings Under Kim Jong Un, North Korea's Response to International Pressure. And this latest report serves as an update to the past report in 2019, but also presents an in-depth analysis of Haesan City, located in Yangang province, which is in the northeast of the country. And to emphasize, so to speak, the special or new component of this report is that it examines how state killings practices under Kim Jong Un's rule have shifted in North Korea.
Okay, and is there a hypothesis that this project was seeking to test?
Yes. So this project tests the hypothesis that a stronger documentation and international advocacy cannot be ignored by the North Korean regime, and perhaps leads to changes on the ground. And so, so this report examines whether these changes actually can be detected in a decade where, both international scrutiny of North Korea's human rights record increased, and then Kim Jong Un consolidated his power.
What kind of changes would you expect to see? Would that be fewer killings or more secretive killings?
Based on our data, as you saw, the number is significantly low than the past reports that we have released. And that is inevitable given the context of North Korea, but on top of that, given the nature of the pandemic. And so, but we have been receiving different testimonies, stories, and also we've been keeping up to date with the reports and news articles published by different outlets that have mentioned secret and indoor killings during the Kim Jong Un era. It's not that the secret killings and indoor killings have not existed before Kim Jong Un came to power,
right?
But then the news articles have mentioned a significant increase of such killings during his regime.
Is there anything that we can say more broadly about how North Korea has changed after 10 years since Kim Jong Un took power? Are there any sort of bigger changes on the ground in North Korea?
So based on the escapee testimonies, they indicate that state-sanctioned killings continued to happen under Kim Jong Un. And the special component of our research is the spatial data analysis. So the spatial data analysis specifically on Haesan.
That's looking at satellite photographs, right?
Yes, for that satellite imagery is from Google Earth. Yes. So spatial data analysis of Haesan points toward a state strategy of selecting locations that are away from the border and residential areas to carry out state-sanctioned killings because those areas are easier to control the assembled crowds. And to add on to that, our interviewees have reported that the assembled audiences at public killing events are being strictly monitored and controlled by state officials than before. And that is to prevent information on public executions from, leaking outside the country. And another interesting finding was that multiple testimonies have mentioned about the use of pardons to propagandize the benevolence of Kim Jong Un's leadership. So that was quite an interesting finding for us.
Let's just talk about the public executions for a second there, because I see an interesting, let's call it a contradiction for a moment, but I guess it comes from perhaps competing incentives. On the one hand, we've got North Korea wanting to make public executions less public, but on the other hand, there are still public executions. So when are executions public and why? Do we know anything about that?
Well, I can tell you based on our findings. So based on this recent report's finding, the public executions have taken place in open spaces and fields, airfields, riverbanks, hills, and mountains. And the list that I just mentioned are all public spaces. However, the interviews have also mentioned about the shift in the locations of public killings. They have mentioned that in the past, these were the very commonly used public spaces for public killings. However, very recently, or for the time that they have been in North Korea recently, they have noticed that public killings are taking in secret locations. And when I asked them as an interviewer, do you know by any chance where those locations may be? And they mentioned that unfortunately they don't because, they're secret killings. And I asked them, then how do you get this information from when you just mentioned that these are happening in secret places? And they mentioned that, through, words of mouth or through, their families and friends who may be working on a state official levels. So the shift in location of where public killings are being held has been extremely difficult to track as a human rights documentation organization. But we have been getting testimonies and stories from our interviews that, the location is changing.
It's interesting, isn't it, that on the one hand, they're having secret executions, but there's a viewing public. And it makes me wonder, are these for specific types of crimes that, that they still want somebody there to witness it? Or is it specific audiences that are being chosen to watch these killings, maybe to serve as an example to them or to frighten them? Do you know anything about that?
Yes. So based on our recent publication, the most commonly cited offenses that were announced at public executions were watching or distributing South Korean videos, drug-related crimes, prostitution, human trafficking, murder or attempted murder, or obscene acts. But before, we have recorded a lot of charges related to stealing and or selling machines or materials pilfered from factories or from infrastructure, such as power lines in the Kim Jong Un era.
Right.
So those are the commonly stated charges at the public executions.
Okay. I think we'll get back to that a bit later on. But first of all, can you tell us about the different sources that you use? You mentioned interviews, but tell us a little bit about that.
You mean different types of sources that we use in our database?
Yes. When you're putting together a mapping project, you're obviously talking to people and looking at spatial data. Tell us a bit about, how many interviews or what kind of interviews and how that process works.
Sure. So our mapping project is primarily based on testimonies from the North Korean escapee community. So as of now, we have 683 interviews with North Korean escapees. And our research is based off of 442 testimonies of killing site locations. But on top of the testimonies, which is the qualitative data, we also utilize free and open source software to record, store, analyze, and visualize testimonies and locations, which the main reason for using the open source software is it gives a powerful geospatially enabled database that permits, a spatial and other types of analysis directly in the database. But also, like I mentioned, as I mentioned previously, we also use Google Earth, which allows access to recent as well as historical satellite imagery. Another source that we use is called the OpenStreetMap, which is sourced by volunteer contributors, and it contains hundreds and thousands of features, including buildings, roads, waterways, and places, and that includes North Korea. So yeah, those are the main sources that we use within our research.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of interviewing people from North Korea? Is that a traumatic experience for them? Are they long interviews?
So the interview usually takes from an hour to sometimes 3 hours, or it could even last a day. Each interview is very unique to themselves, and it's different for each interviewee. So based on my personal experiences conducting interviews with the North Korean escapees during my time at TJWG, I've had witness different interviewees going through different process of unpacking their stories related to human rights violations. So some interviewees will respond by saying how healing this whole process was by just sharing the relief of being able to share such a burdensome story, and just recognizing that this is a shared, collective experiences of so many North Korean, people from North Korea.
Yeah.
That is one experience. But another interviewee have mentioned to me that, the experiences of human rights violation that she's experienced, that, she's sharing with me during the interview, still haunts her to this day.
Oh.
She would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it and not being able to fall asleep. And some might, respond to it differently by saying that, witnessing human rights violation in North Korea did not traumatize them at all. So the repercussions of trauma can manifest in so many different ways. So it's really important for us to emphasize that, and that it's not a single response.
Right.
Each interviewee responds to this differently.
And how do you check interviewees' accounts to make sure that they're verifiable or trustworthy?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Jacko. So within our mapping research, we have an internal system of refining data.
Yeah.
So each data that we collect, whether that be a location or just the story, goes through a rigorous process of refining data, and also to check the credibility of the source that we want to essentially publish in our report. So after it's a very intricate and rigorous process, which could be a bit difficult to understand as an outsider. But we have three main steps. So each step, once we go through each step, the site report figures essentially that we have reporter in our publication that you and other readers see on the report consist of events the interviewee witnessed directly. And this is to simply put, in a more digestible way of understanding this. All of them are witnessed directly by our interviewees, which mean they're firsthand witnesses accounts. And they all have coordinates, which means we're able to identify a location of these reports. And so the majority of our reports from our interviewees processed so far fall into this category. And it's also important for us to mention that the testimony based on rumor or speculation by the interviewee are not included in our report.
How do you avoid the possibility that there might be an incentive for interviewees to exaggerate claims or to tell other people's stories, for example? I mean, are interviewees paid based on how many times or how long they're interviewed or anything like that?
Yeah, that's also an important question. As an organization, but also as a researcher, and I mean, personally, as a researcher of, the mapping research, I take credibility very seriously, and we hold our research to the highest standard possible. As I mentioned to previously, we go through a rigorous process of refining our figures, and that means all of our data collected so far based, from the 6 years of research. But, I mean, yes, we do have that suspicion, or not necessarily suspicion, but we do have that understanding while conducting our research or while conducting interviews with our interviewees as a researcher. So we make sure after the interview is over to fact check to other different, similar sources that might be available in other different research reports. But to answer your question on, whether they're paid based on, the number of hours that they sit in our interview, no, they don't. We do provide a transportation and meal fees for each interviewee, but that does not account for the number of hours that they, take time to interview with us, or the number of times that they show up. Each interview is only done once.
Okay, yeah, because I'm sure you're aware, just in the more broadly in the community, that there are some groups, perhaps not as rigorous as yourself, that pay people according to what stories they tell, and that can have a perverse incentive to tell more stories or tell wilder stories.
Right, correct.
Now, some of the processes that you mentioned of checking your data, that's obviously, that's back end. That's once the interview has already been carried out and that data has been collected. But I'm just wondering, how is it possible to avoid that on the front end before you even interview somebody? Absolutely.
So before we start our interview, we run through a consent form, but I always mention to them, yes, you're here to share your experiences of human rights violation. However, it is totally up to you to share however you want, meaning if you haven't experienced it, then it's perfectly fine for you to share that you have not, or you did not experience any of that. And I reiterate the fact that some people have not, and they have just been referred by a friend to come sit here, in the interview, but some people just simply say, oh yeah, I actually haven't experienced it. And it's important as an interviewer myself to reiterate that before starting an interview, to make the interviewees feel more at ease and comfortable in sharing their experiences of human rights violations in the truest form as possible. And if they haven't experienced it, then it's okay for them to share that they have not experienced it.
Right. How long have you been working with the Transitional Justice Working Group?
I have working at the TJWG for the past year and a half.
Okay. Have you, in that time, come across any interviewees that you think are, this person is just totally unreliable, we can't ask them for another interview ever again?
No, I can't think of any of an incident
okay.
like that. No.
So you mentioned that some of the executions, the more recent ones, are for people who watched South Korean videos in North Korea. Is it fair to say that Kim Jong Un over the last decade has placed a special emphasis on rooting out South Korean culture and information and punishing those who spread it?
I would say yes. Daily NK actually recently obtained, explanatory material for reactionary thought law. I'm sure you're aware of that, Jacko. And that was adopted in December, which is quite recent. And draconian laws like that indicate that Kim Jong Un is paying a particular attention to a South Korean content being exposed to the North Korean people.
Is execution the normal way of punishing somebody right now in North Korea who is guilty of spreading South Korean culture, or is that just one of several different punishments available?
To answer that question, well, the Article 27 of the anti-reactionary thought law calls for sentences of 5 to 15 years of correctional labor against people caught watching or listening, or processing films, recordings, books, drawings, whatever, from South Korea. And also like life sentences of correctional labor and even death for individuals who import and distribute South Korean related content materials.
Right. Now, your report counts 27 testimonies of killings under Kim Jong Un. Did you expect more?
Well, the numbers you see in our report are lower than the actual number of data that we have in our database. As I mentioned previously, we go through a rigorous process of refining our data. As we go through the process for each of our data, we have to, sort out some of the data that we can't, consider to be credible.
Right.
And so the number comes down to, or the number ended up coming down to 27. But, we are definitely aware of the killings that are taking place inside North Korea in secret. And so we definitely expect the numbers to be higher, but given the limited access to the, North Korean escapee community, especially since the pandemic, the low number that you see in our report is something that we've kind of expected.
Okay. Tell us about pardons. Who are they given to and how are they used by the North Korean government? People who are pardoned and let free, like Park Geun-hye was today.
Yes. So it was quite interesting to find people who are being pardoned in North Korea. So based on this recent publication, from 2012 to 2015, so over the course of like 3 years, a number of testimonies suggested that, Kim Jong Un is trying to create this public image as a, forgiving, benevolent leaders through pardon. So the one incident or the one testimony from Pyongyang in 2012 or 2013 mentioned that out of 16 individuals who were put on trial, only 6 were sentenced to death, and the rest were pardoned. And the interview we quoted, it was by the great leader's forgiveness. It wasn't because those 6 individuals were found innocent, right? And another interviewee also gave similar accounts of the accused, specifically female victims of human trafficking, being forgiven by the benevolence of Kim Jong Un at trials. So that was quite interesting. And also,
wait, so what was their actual the crime of the women in North Korea was what? Sorry,
human trafficking. That was the charge that was announced.
Oh, I didn't know that was a crime in North Korea. We hear about it a lot, of course. People brought into China and trafficked there, but I didn't know that was actually a crime in North Korea.
Well, it's really hard to say that the charges announced at trials are or align with the actual acts committed by the accused. And so I think the human trafficking, that phrasing was mentioned by the interviewee. So we try to stick to what the interviewees share with us and to quote their exact words rather than simplifying them or exaggerate them. Right. So these were the words given by the interviewees. Another interesting incident was in 2013, where 15 pardoned women were taken in a bus after the trial, and they were returned to their individual homes. And this happened in Haesan.
Gosh. And just presumably picked up their lives from where they left off.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Wow. And what else did you learn from this particular mapping project?
There are a lot of things that we've learned. I've learned through this mapping project, but one lesson or one thing that still kind of keeps me questioning and keeps me, thinking is the psychological repercussions of trauma and, psychological repercussions, based on violence perpetrated by the North Korean government. We've actually had a significant data based on, traumatic experiences experienced by the North Korean escapees. And they have shared different ways that, this experience still haunts them to this day. And as a researcher, I could not help but think about, the generational impact, perhaps, the hunting experiences of this community may not only, end here, but, will definitely affect generations to come. And so just kind of thinking about how, the perpetration of violence by the North Korean regime doesn't only affect the North Korean escapee community or the North Korean people inside North Korea, but people outside of that too, the activists, researchers, and also the people of Korean descent as well.
How many mapping projects have been released before this most recent one?
So we've released 2 reports, so one in 2017 and one in 2019 before this one.
Okay. And is there anything, like, are they simply updates, or is there something that's fundamentally that distinguishes this one from the previous 2 reports?
So this one in particular is not only an update to the past 2 reports, but this has a special component of an in-depth analysis of Haesan, which essentially shows patterns of killings, before Kim Jong Un and during Kim Jong Un, kind of indicating that there has been a shift.
Right. And Haesan is a city quite close to the border with China, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
Right. Okay. People can find that report on your website, can they, and download it and read it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, the website that you mentioned during the introduction, they can go there and find our report and download it in a PDF file.
Right. We will include a link in the show notes to the website there. Okay. Now, I want to ask you, how do you hope that the results of your work will be used?
Yes, that's a really good question. Well, we hope to continue spreading awareness of human rights violation in North Korea perpetrated by the Kim regime, through the use of brutal and inhumane practice of violence. And our mapping project, as you know, documents human rights violations to support a stronger push for accountability as part of conceptualizing transitional justice for North Korea. And so, based on our recent publication and its findings, we've shown that, stronger documentation and international advocacy cannot be ignored by the North Korean leadership, and perhaps, leads to changes on the ground. So we hope that our work can be used for that matter. Has
the report received much media attention inside or outside Korea since it was published?
Well, inside North Korea, just generally South Korea, you mean?
Yeah, sorry. Let me rephrase that. I think I messed that up. Has the report received much media attention inside or outside South Korea?
Yeah, South Korea, definitely. The report has received significant global attention since its publication on December 15. And as of last Tuesday, our executive director updated us the number of articles that were written about our report so far. And that was over 160 articles and in 10 different languages.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's quite a lot of pickup. Of course, NK News, we reported on it the day of the release, so December 15th. And the New York Times had an article out the next day about it. But I also saw that the Daily Mail, generally a sensation-seeking British tabloid, published an article on December 17th, and its headline, it likes long headlines, its headline was, North Korean executioners publicly mutilate bodies with one-man corpse burned by a flamethrower as his father was made to watch, and torment prisoners due to die, report finds. Does the headline accurately represent the findings of the report?
So the headline is, this story is just one facet of the whole entire report. We understand as to why, certain media would use such example like that to make it a headline, to grab people's attention, because, such details provide a powerful image of what kind of violence Kim Jong Un imposes on his people. But we want to, raise awareness of the diverse and nuanced experiences that the North Korean people have experienced inside North Korea. Yes, this type of, inhumane, brutal violence does take place and have been experienced by people from North Korea, but there are also other sides of the stories too. So it's very important for us to not be focused on just one, single story, but rather look at the story from a broader angle, and to, remind ourselves that, these are human experiences, which means they are diverse, they're unique to themselves, they're nuanced.
Right. But obviously the problem is when you've got a long report that few people will read in its entirety, and then when it gets reported in the media, that often gets distilled down to its most sensational points, doesn't it? Is there a concern inside the Transitional Justice Working Group that its careful and rigorous and nuanced research could be abused and oversimplified to another North Korea is a weird and crazy place story, and basically painting North Koreans as something other than human?
Absolutely, Jacko. That's a constant concern for us as an organization who deals with such delicate human stories, right? And it's not just human stories, but these are stories of our friends, that we've now called our family. As a researcher myself, but also interviewer, and someone who's been involved with different projects, but also have worked with North Korean escapee communities over the past several years. These are my friends' stories, and so we do take this matter seriously, and it's very unfortunate as an organization to see this sensational type of story to be only acknowledged and to be reported, and unfortunately is the only information that outside readers might receive or get to hear about North Korea. And so as a reader, I think it's always our responsibility, as a reader, to be mindful of different experiences that a person goes through, or a society goes through, or a country goes through, and to, fact check and to continue looking at the country, or, monitoring the country from a multi-dimensional angle, not just through a single, set of lens,
And beyond media coverage, is there also a concern that the TJWG's work could be used or misused by a more hawkish government in South Korea or the US to launch kinetic strikes on North Korea?
Yes, there is a concern of that. And so once that actually happens, then we will take action to that, and we do take preventative measures to that. But and that definitely is a concern of our organization.
The issues that the Transitional Justice Working Group seeks to highlight, state-sanctioned killings and abductions and other human rights abuses, these seem to be problems that can really only be worked on at a fundamental level, or even solved after there is some form of deep transformation in North Korea. Back to this concept of transition again, a change of government. Is it fair to say that the TJWG seeks and advocates for regime change in North Korea?
To answer your question, the transitional justice mechanism, as you mentioned, takes place after a transition occurs. But this is a preparatory work. We cannot wait until the transition occurs and then do the work. Then it will be way too late. So we take the preparation work very seriously. And even if the transition might not happen, like tomorrow or like decades down the road, it's extremely important for us to build this infrastructure of transitional justice mechanism to be implied on the Korean Peninsula context when the transition occurs. And so, this specific work of locating sites is crucial in preventing, blanket amnesty for perpetrators. And not only that, it's extremely important in terms of like quickly, securing forensic and documentary evidence in the future for investigations and also trials of individuals charged with serious, human rights violations. And so, yes, this work may seem far-fetched for some people, but extremely important to continue doing it now.
But let's pretend for a moment, or let's assume for a moment that North Korea will continue as it is with its current form of government, its current system for another 50 years, well beyond our lifetimes. Can justice even be said to take place? When victims and perpetrators are long since dead, what kind of justice is possible?
That's a really important question, and it's a question that we ask ourselves all the time too. To answer that question, I want to emphasize the fact that the core of transitional justice is the recognition that those who have been most affected by human rights abuses should be the ones who guide the process and design the remedies after transition occurs. So this is quite a bottom-up approach rather than the top-down approach that we often see in our societies, and this may come at the expense of, the top-down approach sometimes, may come at the expense of speaking truth to power. However, this, bottom-up approach, the transitional justice, mechanism approach gives, victims or survivors the power and the control to, speak truth to power. And so, this transitional justice process seeks to the need to empower our survivors, our victims, as they move forward into the future, whether it be, in South Korea and inside North Korea, that's really difficult, right? And people in North Korea, as a documentation group, what we can do best is to continue doing our work so that we can raise awareness of the human rights abuses that they're experiencing by the regime. And hopefully that would push the Kim Jong Un regime to make changes on the ground.
Have you, I'm just curious whether you've got any historical examples of places or transitions that you look to either inspire or to guide you or to model after, or as perhaps as a negative model of how it shouldn't work?
Yes. So we do look at different societies. Personally, I was in Rwanda. So just looking at the historical example, after the Rwandan genocide occurred in 1994, the transition occurred and they went through a transitional justice process. The Gacaca court, for instance, that invited, perpetrators and the victims of mass atrocities were invited for and put on trial together on a more of a local way. It wasn't like these trials weren't held at courts. They were held in the backyards of their neighborhoods, right? And so, looking at these kind of examples are, kind of pushing us to look at the Korean context in a more localized way. How can, transition justice process or mechanism can take place in the Korean context in a way that serves the Korean people, in a way that it, prioritizes the cultural aspect of the Korean peninsula. So yeah, that's one example.
What about it within South Korea itself? I'm thinking about the transitions from a military dictatorship to a civilian government, or even how South Korea dealt with North Korean pro-North Korea collaborators who were working together with the Korean People's Army in the early part of the Korean War in 1950. Have you looked into how some of those, how justice was meted out in some of those cases?
Yes. So we actually conducted our research that specifically looks at transitional justice from a North Korean escapees perspective. And that research can be found on our website as well. And it was produced as a report as well. So it looks at, we asked our interviewees of how different transitional justice mechanisms should take place in the context of Korean Peninsula from their own experiences and also from their own perspective. So giving them the ownership of kind of imagining what kind of transitional justice process they want to see in the Korean Peninsula context. So that was quite an interesting research because not only does it focus on the survivors, it gives them the autonomy to give us not necessarily the answer, but give us the ideas of what the transitional justice should look like that encapsulates the perspectives of the North Korean escapee communities. It cannot only be, the perspectives of people who are in charge, but rather, it has to be bottom up, right? The perspectives of North Korean people should be at the center of the transitional justice that will take place in the future, hopefully, in the Korean context. So that report was published, I believe, in 2019, actually. It's called Exploring Grassroots Transitional Justice and can be found on our website as well. Okay,
and you publish all of your reports in both English and Korean, do you?
Yes. So in the past, they were only in English and Korean, but lately we've also included the Spanish translation.
Okay. Right.
That could be found on all on our website.
Does the Transitional Justice Working Group have in its mission statement or goals or any of its official documentation a statement about how it feels or when it feels transition should take place in North Korea? Or is it really just we're getting the documentation ready, but whenever it happens, it'll happen?
Yeah, whenever it happens, it will happen. Hopefully not too late, but because the work that we're doing is the preparation of the transition that hopefully will take place in our lifetime. But if not, then this work doesn't go to waste. This work will maintain to be as important to the future generation. And so whenever it happens, hopefully our work can provide a path or a guidance to a transitional justice mechanism to be implemented in the Korean Peninsula context.
And have you seen any sign of either South Korean or American political groups using Transitional Justice Working Groups research for political purposes to try to bring about regime change in North Korea?
So far, no, we have not seen any political or activist groups that have used our research to bring about regime change.
And what's next for the Transitional Justice Working Group and the mapping project?
So aside from documenting and mapping the main 3 types of locations connected to human rights violations, the next step specifically for the mapping project, we want to focus on collecting data on secret and indoor killings. And we also want to conduct a chain of command study to understand, which individuals or state agencies may be responsible for, these state-led killings. And so both of these directions will support our ongoing research, collecting escapee testimonies and locating points of interest to push for accountability.
Now, that must be becoming quite hard these days because, as I'm sure you're aware, defector numbers are way, way down in the last 2 years, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's been extremely difficult for us. And that will continue to be a huge predicament that we will continue to face as a human rights documentation group, working on North Korean human rights violations. So that's why the collaboration with other CSOs have been extremely, extremely important. We've been partnering with Daily NK, and that has been extremely invaluable for us as an organization because they have these connections inside North Korea that we don't have, who share about what's actually happening on the ground. And so this mutual collaboration and work has been extremely important as a documentation group to continue documenting despite all odds, and despite how difficult and challenging it's become to reach North Korean escapees who have the most recent information related to this matter inside North Korea. So we hope to further our collaboration with other groups to continue this collective effort in documenting human rights violations that are continuing to happen under the Kim Jong Un regime.
So your work is far from finished.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We have a long way to go.
I want to go back as a final question. I want to go back to there are 3 different types of locations that you map in the mapping project. And we talked a bit about the killing sites. We didn't talk much about grave sites. But the third one, official locations which may house documents or other evidence related to these events. And I've been interested for a long time by the prospect that in North Korea there must be huge paper archives because digitalization is a slow process. It hasn't completely happened in North Korea yet, and B, people are encouraged to write written reports about everything. I mean, we've heard in multiple sources that when a North Korean has an extended conversation with a foreigner, for example, that there must be a report on that. So I could just imagine that there must be huge archives in the country. Is that something that you've mapped out as well, like where these document centers are in North Korea and how big the buildings are and done some calculations of how much must, how many floors are there and how much paper must each floor carry and that sort of thing?
Yes, Jaco, that's extremely an important question. Thank you so much for bringing it up. We were able to identify a Yangon provincial archive and the entrance to the storage unit, by the formal prosecutor from Hesan. And so, he was able to provide information on, to the amount of document that might be stored in this archive, and the possibility of such archive existing in each province. And so that's what we didn't include the location of Gyeongdo, the archive, in our map for security reasons, but we hope to continue looking for such location from interviewee testimonies, because as you mentioned, it's extremely important to find these locations where they're storing massive, amount of evidential documentations related to human rights violations. So yes,
and not just human rights violations, but really, everything related to North Korean workings of the government, to surveillance, to the party, and if you've got a 70-year plus consistent system there. And paper takes up a lot of volume, it's very heavy, and it needs special conditions. So you must imagine that every 10 to 20 years, they'll be building more of these buildings, and, with special temperature control or climate control things to keep the paper safe, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I want to thank you once again for coming on the show today, Ahyeong Park. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Jaco, for having me. It was a great pleasure to talk about, the recent publication that we released, and hope that, the stories of the interviewees, the North Korean escapees that we've, had the pleasure and an honor to talk to can, spread as far and wide as possible. Thank you.
You're welcome. And don't forget, listeners, you can find the Transitional Justice Working Group online at TJWG Seoul on Twitter, or en.tjwg.org. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News subscription, take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. Inquire about access at membership at nknews.org today. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, you can always send them to us at podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Arias Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.